Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today I'm going to be talking about the philosophical and intellectual foundations of the trans activists' justification for including trans women in the female sports category. So, trans activists want to say that it is perfectly fair for trans women to compete in the female category because there is this sort of idea that's been floating out there in the feminist world, stemming from Judith Butler mostly. Judith Butler famously wrote this book, Gender Trouble, in 1990. And Judith Butler sort of argued that the very distinction between sex and gender is, problematic, and that the concept of sex, the idea of sex existing as a biological category that is independent of culture, independent of social categories, like Judith Butler called into question the legitimacy of the sex gender distinction and more or less said that the concept of sex is itself just as socially constructed as the concept of gender. And this idea that the sex gender distinction is somehow problematic, that the concept of sex is socially constructed, provides a strong justification philosophically for trans activists to say that trans women, even though they were, quote unquote, assigned male at birth, that they, have an equal right to participate in the female sports division because, to some extent, the very concept of female is itself socially mediated, socially constructed, and so they don't really see a problem with having someone who is male compete in the female category because they say that these distinctions between male and female are to some extent arbitrary, they're socially constructed, and that there's not really a firm basis. So it's a lot of postmodern gender theory philosophy, like doing a lot of work here in terms of providing these sort of intellectual milieu in which the trans activists can make these claims. So I want to talk about this sort of idea from Judith Butler that the sex gender distinction is problematic. So this is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is a pretty good article, Feminist Perspectives on Sex and Gender. Let's see. The claim is that one possible way to understand woman in this claim is to take it as a sex term. Woman picks out human females, and being a human female depends on various biological and anatomical features. Historically, many feminists have understood woman differently, not as a sex term, but as a gender term that depends on social cultural factors. In doing so, they distinguish sex, being female or male, from gender, being a woman or a man, although most ordinary language users appear to treat the two interchangeably. In feminist philosophy, this distinction has generated a lively debate. So the key question is, what does it mean for gender to be distinct from sex, if anything at all? How should we understand the claim that gender depends on social or cultural factors? What does it mean to be a gendered woman, man, or genderqueer? Okay, so I'm particularly interested in this section here, problems with the sex gender distinction. So it's calling into question the legitimacy of saying that, being male has to do with, your sex, and being a man or woman has to do with, gender. So I'm also particularly interested in this section here. Is sex classification solely a matter of biology? So many people, including many feminists, have ordinarily taken sex ascriptions to be solely a matter of biology with no social or cultural dimension. It is commonplace to think that there are only two sexes and that biological sex classifications are utterly unproblematic. So they want to call into question the idea that a biological sex classification is unproblematic in the sense of it's not constrained by social, cultural, linguistic factors, that so when you say that the classification is problematic, you're essentially saying it's socially constructed and it's mediated by normativity and power dynamics. um, uh, so, by contrast, some feminists have argued that sex classifications are not unproblematic and that they're not solely a matter of biology. So this is a claim I want to hone in on because it is the key philosophical basis for the trans activist claim that trans women belong in the female sports category, because they say that being male or female is not solely a matter of biology. It is a socially constructed fact to some way or another. So let's see. So they distinguish between um, uh, object and idea construction. So with object construction, so there's object construction of sex bodies. Secondary sex characteristics, or the physiological or biological features commonly associated with males and females, are affected by social practices. In some societies, females' lower social status has meant that they have been fed less, and so the lack of nutrition has had the effect of making them smaller in size. Um, the differences of muscular shape, size, and strength, that they're not caused entirely by biological factors, but depends on exercise. So if males and females were allowed the same exercise opportunities and equal encouragement to exercise, it is thought that bodily dimorphism would diminish. Okay, so this is already so wrong-headed because while yes, if females, exercise more or were encouraged to exercise just as much as males, the bodily dimorphism might diminish a tiny bit, but it doesn't really make sense to me, at least, that it would diminish to the point of erasing the underlying sexual dimorphism, because that underlying sexual dimorphism is, largely attributable to the fact of going through male puberty and these, strong dimorphic, result that male puberty confers, such that there are a whole host of differences between males and females, and that difference between males and females confers a sporting advantage. So I just recently talked about this, but in 2019, 10,000 males ran faster in the 400-meter event than the top three fastest females recorded. So 10,000 female or males, including some males that were younger than 18 years old, ran faster than the top three fastest women in the entire world in 2019 in that particular event. So that's pretty astonishing. I mean, that's a pretty strong dimorphism, such that men have a incredible physiological advantage at the elite level of sport. And I don't think, just a little bit more exercise when females are, young would do anything to diminish that sexual dimorphism, because these are elite female athletes. They've probably been athletic their whole lives, but they don't even come close to the male achievements in sports. Why? Because there are these these fundamental physiological differences between males and females that confer a physiological advantage in sporting domains. Okay, so another thing, a number of medical phenomena involving bones, like osteoporosis, have social causes directly related to expectations about gender, women's diet. So these examples suggest that physiological features thought to be sex-specific traits not affected by social and cultural factors are, after all, to some extent, products of social conditioning. Social conditioning then shapes our biology. I mean, that is not controversial, but that does not in any way undermine you know the fact that sex, in terms of the difference between males and females, predates all these social practices. I mean, sex goes back millions of years. Like sexual reproduction is an evolved evolutionary strategy. So to claim that, like, oh, it's like social conditioning, yeah, like obviously humans interact with the environment. Obviously, there's like a feedback loop between the male body, the female body, and the cultural social environment. But that doesn't say that the very difference, like the very like membership criteria of what it means to be male and female, is itself in any way socially constructed. And okay, so that's what the second thing is about, the idea construction of sex concepts. Our concept of sex is said to be a product of social forces, in the sense that what counts as sex is shaped by social meaning. Standardly, with XX chromosomes, ovaries that produce large eggs, female genitalia, a relatively high proportion of female hormones. See, they're like even using female hormones and like air quotes, like quote unquote female hormones. That's like, um, and other secondary sex characteristics. Um, so those with XY chromosomes, testes that produce small sperm cells, are counted as male. This understanding is fairly recent. The prevalent scientific view from ancient Greeks until the late 18th century did not consider female and male sex as to be distinct categories. Okay, so this doesn't matter. Like, we also didn't learn that the Earth revolves around the sun until recently, but it doesn't like the fact that we discovered that only like I don't know a few centuries ago or whatever. Like that doesn't negate the fact that the Earth has always been revolving around the sun. So in my opinion, the most scientifically parsimonious account of like what it means to be male and female is based on the evolution of sexual reproduction itself. So, sex is a sexual reproduction is an adaptive feature which is common to almost all multicellular organisms and various unicellular organisms. There is a specific adaptive advantage to sexual reproduction. Otherwise, it would have never evolved in the first place. Well, what is sexual reproduction? It is the reproduction like between males and females. Um, like so, it evolved, and it evolved across the animal kingdom or whatever. It sort of it's much broader than humans. So this whole idea of focusing on like the human conception of, sex and talking about like, the social construction of like our scientific categories, it's sort of irrelevant because, just like we have come up with scientific theories of what sex is. And we have the two sex model, like males, um, like are constituted such that they are predisposed to go down a developmental pathway that organizes the body around the production of small gametes, and vice versa for females with large gametes. And it is about this developmental pathway. So there are two developmental pathways, the sperm pathway and the ova pathway. And that is what constitutes sex, because that is the fundamental basis for the evolution of sexual reproduction. That is like how like sex evolved in the first place. That just like is what sex is. So if you're not talking about sperm and ova, then you're not really talking about sex, because it is like and that's why there's also not a third sex, because there's not three gametes. There's only two gametes. There's small ones and there's big ones. So like when you're talking about sex, you should be talking about evolution. And I don't think the term evolution is like mentioned in this article whatsoever. But yeah, this idea that like, oh well, this like these scientific conceptions didn't arose until the late 18th century, so therefore sex is a socially constructed, like, yeah, like our ideas, our thoughts are socially mediated, but the thing itself, the thing that it picks out, so um, sperm and egg are not socially constructed. Like that is the thing. Like sperm and egg are not socially constructed. They are real things out in the real world that have existed for millions of years, completely independent of any human theorizing. Um, okay, so Fausto Sterling has argued that this two-sex model isn't straightforward. Based on a meta-study of empirical medical research, she estimates that 1.7% of the population failed to neatly fall within the usual sex classifications, possessing various combinations of different sex characteristics. Okay, so this is also completely misleading, because she's trying to say there are beyond male and female, there's three further sex classes: herms, who possess one testes and one ovary. And this is the only like true hermaphrodites. Like that is the only thing that calls into question the sort of strict binary between going down the sperm pathway and the egg pathway, because there are some in which it's sort of not clear on the gamete account of whether you're on the sperm pathway or the ova pathway. Um, but these other cases, like merms who possess testes, aka sperm pathway, and some aspects of female genitalia, that means that the developmental pathway went awry in some way or another. Um, or firms who have ovaries and some aspect of female genitalia. Okay, so they went on the ova pathway. It's just that that developmental pathway went wrong to some extent, which is why it's important to say that what it means to be male means going down, like having a predisposition to go down a developmental pathway to organize the body around the production of sperm under normal circumstances. And then it's that under normal circumstances that is important, because it calls out the fact that yes, like when there's not normal circumstances, that developmental pathway can go awry. And that is what leads to these intersex conditions or DSD, disorders of sexual development. But the mere fact that there are disorders of sexual development or differences of sexual development doesn't negate the fact that it, in the vast majority of cases, like like uh, it is very clear whether you're on the male pathway or the female pathway. And this 1.7 estimate, it's not actually true, because the 1.7 includes the firms and the merms, but on the gamete account, like merms are very clearly male because they possess testes, and firms are very clearly females because they possess ovaries. Or it's not really that they possess them, because if you get them removed later, you don't stop being female. It's just that you were on the developmental pathway towards the development of organizing your body around the production of these things. Like that's what it means. So yeah, just the fact that you have a hysterectomy later doesn't make you suddenly stop being, male or female. And if you're male, if you get castrated later, you lose your testicles. That doesn't make you stop being male, because you went down the developmental pathway that organized your body towards the development of these things. So it's not about your current possession of them either. It's about going down a developmental pathway towards organizing the body around the production of these things under normal circumstances. So if you include, if you exclude these merms and firms, this 1.7% drops pretty significantly to a very, 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 very small percentage. And so that doesn't question the two-sex model, because the two-sex model doesn't require that there are absolutely zero edge cases. Like there can be a binary and still be edge cases. Like just like if you are saying like, oh, there's no such thing as being bald, because being bald and non-bald, there's like a continuum between them. That is called the continuum fallacy. And okay, for another example, this comes from Kathleen Stock, I think. Like, just because there is a edge case with Pluto being a planet or not, that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as planets, or that the distinction between planet and non-planet is not a binary. Like you're either a planet or you're not a planet. But just because Pluto is an edge case doesn't mean that there's not a binary between planet and non-planet. Similarly, just because there are a very, 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 very small percentage of edge cases doesn't mean that the two-sex model or the binary model is like false in some way, because there are, males and females, and it's almost entirely unambiguous which pathway you are on in the vast majority of cases. And the fact that there are some true hermaphrodites doesn't negate that whatsoever. It's just a logical fallacy. Okay, so let's go on. So insofar as our cultural conceptions affect our understandings of sex, feminists must be much more careful about sex classifications and rethink what sex amounts to. Okay, they're talking about sex as like a cluster concept. I don't like the cluster concept, because I think it just is confusing. I think it's much more simple to talk about the sperm and the egg and the two gamete accounts, and having a gametic account of what it means to be male and female, because I think the gametic account fits into what we know about evolution, and it also fits into certain, evolutionary uh, strategies. So, for example, the parental investment theory in evolutionary biology. Uh, Parental investment theory, a term coined by Robert Trivers in 1972, predicts that the sex that invests more in its offspring will be more selective when choosing a mate. And the less investing sex will have an intersexual competition for access to mates. This theory has been influential in explaining sex differences in sexual selection and mate preferences throughout the animal kingdom and humans. Okay, so what makes like what is one of the factors in investing more in the offspring? Well, Bateman's principle. Um, Bateman suggests that since males are capable of producing millions of sperm with little effort, while females invest much higher levels of energy in order to nurture a relatively small number of eggs, the female plays a significantly larger role in the offspring's reproductive success. And this ties into sex differences in human mating strategies. Due to differential parental investment, the less investing sex should display more intersexual competitiveness. And so, this to me is what sex is all about. It's about evolution. It's about uh, understanding the fact that there are these differences between the creatures that produce eggs and the creatures that produce sperm that confers different evolutionary strategies, and that impacts sexual selection, which is one of the driving forces of evolutionary adaptation. So this is what sex is about. This is what the evolution of sex is about. It's about these different evolutionary strategies, these different adaptive strategies that have to do with whether you are producing sperm or whether you're producing ova. That impacts, the behavior and the psychology and the sexual selection and the mathematical game theoretic models about how natural selection works. And there's been so much research on this. Like, this is what this is about, and it's not socially constructed because this is all applicable across the animal kingdom. And so it's just like that to me is what makes sense. So let's make sex a matter of degree, and sex classification should be take place on a spectrum. No, I already talked about that. It's not a spectrum. One can be more or less female or male. No, you're either on the sperm pathway or the female pathway. And there is a sharp difference because it is the sharp difference between males and females that produces the massive sexual dimorphism between males and females that we see in elite sporting. This is why we have male and female divisions in sports, because there is a sharp difference. Okay, so I'm going to skip past this section here. So here's another thing. Okay, are sex and gender distinct? In addition to arguing against identity politics and for gender performativity, Butler holds that this distinguishing biological sex from social gender is unintelligible. This is a famous passage that has been so influential in trans theory that it undergirds a lot of the trans activist theorizing about, why it's okay for trans women to compete in the female sports, because they say the concept of female is gendered. So let's see. She says, if the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always already gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all. So she's saying that the concept of sex has already been gendered, it's already been culturally mediated, it's already been socially constructed, and that this distinction between sex and gender is no distinction at all. This provides a theoretical fundamental basis for trans activism. This is what it's all about right here, because this provides the justification for including trans women in the female category, because they say this attempt to carve up the female category to exclude trans women, that's based on normativity and culture, and it's just because we're all transphobic as a society, and it's just a product of cis normativity, cis sexism, And if only we weren't so transphobic as a society, then we would like socially construct the category of the female sex to include trans women. And so this is like critical to the trans activist project. And Butler is not alone in claiming that there are no tenable distinctions between nature, culture, biology, construction, and sex and gender. Okay, so sex is a social construction, and that sex is gender. Okay, so Butler says our sex bodies are also performative in that they have no ontological status apart from the various acts which constitute their reality. The position is that bodies viewed as the material foundations on which gender is constructed are themselves constructed as if they provide such material foundations. The very apparatus of production whereby sexes themselves are established. So what she's saying is that sex bodies never exist outside social meanings, and how we understand gender shapes how we understand sex. Um, Sex bodies are themselves discursively constructed, because this is about how the sex assignment process, calling someone male or female, is normative. When a doctor calls a newly born infant a girl or boy, she's not making a descriptive claim, but a normative one. This is critical. They're saying that like it is a speech act. So the mere fact of assigning a gender, assigning a sex, constitutes the construction or the performativity of the normativity of that category. So it is essentially a performance. So when an umpire shouts the word strike, that shouting, it is not only an action, but it constitutes the legitimacy. It is like legally binding within the baseball world. Or when you say like guilty in court, like the act of saying guilty institutes a legal process. It kicks off a legal process. So it is a speech act. If you christen a ship by smashing the bottle, it is a christening itself, which constitutes a legal act. So it's not just the speech act saying like, hey, you're male, you're female. It actually is constituted with the very meaning of the thing. So this is what Butler is saying about the category of sex itself. Physical bodies never exist outside cultural and social meanings, and that sex is just as socially constructed as gender. They do not deny that physical bodies exist. Oh, I was starting to be skeptical. I'm glad they say physical bodies exist. But they take our understanding of this existence to be a product of social conditioning. Okay, so this is so wrong because, yes, while arguably human culture, like very, very arguably, it is very true that the male and female body interacts with culture and interacts with society. That is undeniable. But what it means to be male and female is not socially mediated, because like all this evolution stuff that applies across the animal kingdom, like like it's about sperm and egg, like sperm, like these penguins, you know, they they're not socially constructed, they're not socially mediated. This like Bateman's principle about like males producing millions of sperm, like this is true across the like animal kingdom. It has nothing to do with like culture or social construction or doctors assigning sex at birth, or something like this. Like a penguin's like sex is not assigned at birth. Like the very real fundamental biological reality of their sex like drives these differences in behavior. Like it is the very real differences that drive the evolution of sex. It like the adaptive advantage of sexual reproduction is completely independent of cultural and social factors. Even though those factors do play a role in influencing them, but it's not what defines membership in the category of being male and female, which has to do with being on the sperm pathway or the egg pathway. Furthermore, Butler says that sex assignment is always in some sense oppressive. This appears to be because Butler's general suspicion of classification. Sex classification can never merely be descriptive, but always has a normative element reflective of valuative claims of those who are powerful. So she's saying that when we distinguish between males and females in order to construct a sports category that is fair, that is oppressive. Oh, we're oppressing females by dividing up the male and female category. No, we don't divide up the male and female category in sports because we're trying to oppress females. We're trying to protect them because if they had to compete against males, they would overwhelmingly lose, and it would just destroy the female sports category itself because they don't stand a chance in competition because males, in virtue of going through male puberty, have an overwhelming physiological advantage, which is why like 10,000 males in 2019 ran faster in the 400 meter than the top 3 females in the entire world. So that is why we divide up the sports. It's not because we're oppressing females, and it's not about oppressing trans women either, because we do this not because we're trying to oppress anyone, but because we're trying to make it fair, and we make things fair based on very real sex differences, biological differences between males and females. Um, so, uh, yeah, I don't know. Th- this is like what it's all about, really. And this is why, like, I talk about this issue so much, because it's not about sports per se. It's not merely about sports. It is about whether we have a firm understanding of evolution and science and biology, and whether male and female pick pick out a biological concept, or whether we want to make it problematic by trying to say that this is all socially constructed. And I think this idea of social construction is dangerous because it's all great in theory, it's all great in the academia, it's all theoretical, but now it has resulted in the very real pragmatic thing happening, which is that trans women are now competing in the female sports division, and it constitutes a safety risk. It constitutes a principle of fairness that it's violating. So I just think this is it's not just theoretical. This is not just academic ivory tower talk. It has an impact on the real world, and we're starting to see it. And I think the sports issue is the clearest area where we see this social constructivist idea take place. And I think we need to combat this using, principles of objective epistemology that, sort of like make space for the possibility that the concept of sex is not problematic. It's not socially constructed. It's not, and I think we got to maintain the objectivity of sex categories. Otherwise, we're just saying that like we're unable to pick out what's real and what's not real. And I don't know. So hopefully all this made sense. I think this is a big rant on my part, but I just like this has been percolating in my mind and I had to talk about it. So hopefully this all made sense. Thanks for watching. Bye.